with audio. So welcome. This is, I think it's our second edition of the forum online. And it's always great. Well, while I like to say we have new faces to see, most people have their video off. So I can't actually technically say that, but we do get some newcomers to the forum, which has been a great experience for us. So I'm going to do this a little bit. It's going to be a hybrid between our chamber chats that we've been doing. We do have one coming up this Wednesday, by the way, which I'll make sure I announce. But I usually talk about what we're seeing and hearing and then cut over to our speakers. So let me do a quick screen share of the last e-newsletter that went out on Friday. Oops, hold on. I'm trying to do the wrong button. Okay, so you should be looking at my last e-newsletter. The biggest news is the payroll protection program changes have gone through and were approved. The biggest thing is it's going from 8 weeks to 24 weeks in the time period that people have to use the PPP funds. The loan maturing has been extended. The usage requirement, so it used to be 75% payroll, that's now 60% payroll support coming out of the PPP, which basically frees up money to spend elsewhere. There will be no PPP loans after June 30th, and a couple more things. Tax deferrals are now able to be used in addition to the payroll protection program, and businesses could be exempt from having to pay back. So let me backtrack on that one a little bit. So the PPP is a grant if the businesses get all of their payroll back to the same level. Now they're saying that it still could be a grant if the businesses have made every effort to get back to that same level. Congratulations and many thanks to Verve, who I know Chris Butler's on the call here. They have pledged a $10,000 match to the La Crosse Community Foundation funds. A small business survey. So this is actually a survey for consumers that we've partnered with Downtown Main Street. So it's saying, when are you thinking you're going to go back? What are you currently, they're not going back to spending, it's consumer spending. So what are you doing currently? What are your hesitations? It's really trying to help the businesses gauge as to what the consumer spending is going to be looking like. As I've always told businesses, you can open your doors, but that doesn't mean that people are going to walk through it. So having some idea of when they will feel comfortable is helpful for our businesses. We continue with our jobs board. I think we had 147 jobs posted on our Facebook page that is out there. Otherwise, a couple of other things. We are starting to get back to a little bit of chamber as normal, and I'll stop sharing because you don't need to see the screen for that. We are starting to get back to that, and it starts with our golf outing. So our golf outing is going to happen. It is going to be in person. We will not have as many golfers, and it may even be one person to a golf cart. So the golf course is feeling all of that out, but in the meantime, we will sell out as much as we can and possibly add golfers after that, depending on how things open up. We are also, as of this morning, I started getting our first calls from consumers, the public, saying, can these businesses charge a COVID fee? And the answer is yes. The example this morning, though, was a $10 haircut added a $5 fee. And so there's going to be a ripple effect because the person said, well, now they're not getting a tip because now I'm paying $5 as a COVID fee. So that will start to get interesting. We're all in funding. So WEDC announced another round of grants, and this one is for small businesses, 30,000 businesses, $2,500 each. And the most important thing is, in part to help us out, it requires a letter from an entity like a chamber that can verify the business has been in existence prior to COVID. So if you're planning on applying for those funds, let us know ASAP that you need that letter so that we don't bog you down. The other thing that's been interesting, there was requests for information sent out from UW-La Crosse that is looking for additional housing for students. And what I had heard was this is coming due to COVID, not being able to put as many students in dorm rooms. And so now there's going to be a need for extra rooms that could be happening out in the community. Most of the apartments have already been filled. So really this is a opportunity for our hotels that don't have a lot of occupancy to look at some potential revenue. And then on Wednesday, just a heads up, we do have a chamber chat that's going to be on marketing businesses during COVID. So that is all I have, which saves us announcements at the end, which has been our typical routine for forums, but I like to get them out of the way, so to speak, at the beginning, so that people's audio can get up and running as we head into our speakers. So in typical forum fashion, I'm going to ask Jennifer Schilling, who, as many of you know, has recently retired from the Senate, has a job with Dairyland Power now, and she came onto the call and I said, hey, would you like to say a few words? And so I'm going to send it over to Jennifer, and then Joe, do you want to take it right after Jennifer? Go ahead, Jennifer.
Oops. Well, thank you, Vicki, and it has been my pleasure to join the forum, notably the Cracker Barrel, for the last 20 years to give legislative updates and to be one on the other side of the podium. As you are well aware, I announced I would not seek re-election in April, and I resigned May 15th from the Senate to pursue career opportunities, and I'm really excited to be joining Dairyland Power in their government relations team. And I know that Nathan is on the phone, and I just want to say thank you for transition. It's been a fantastic first week. I was happy on Monday that this morning I logged in and I could still log into Dairyland, and that I could return for my second week. But just wanted to say that this format has been really valuable for local elected officials to give legislative updates, to hear from our business community over the years about issues that are pending before the legislature. And I really did think on some of those hot button issues that we had to take votes on. Like, I would vote and I would think, how do I explain this back home at the next forum, or the next Cracker Barrel, but the next forum with that business community and that crowd. That it really does hold us accountable. It is fantastic for information exchanges and to seeking, as a legislator, I guess now a recovering legislator, former legislator, we're jack of all trades, masters of none, and to look at the small business community and the larger business community for that input is really valuable. And now I look forward to learning about utility issues and learning the acronyms. I think there are more acronyms in the utility world than there are in government. And so it's an exciting new chapter for my family. I'm really excited. And certainly I have big shoes to fill in the government relations team with Brian and Kenrick and with Nathan. But I assure people I bring my own shoes. I will bring my own work boots to the new job. And so I look forward to that. Someone asked if I wanted a new pair of steel toe boots. I said, of course not. You don't have any credibility with new boots. You need the ones that are worked in, that you've been on the family farm and in the ditches looking at stuff. So I'll bring my own pair of shoes, but looking forward to continuing to be involved with the chamber. Again, now being able to ask questions and listen and flag things for our elected officials. But just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to serve in the legislature, the assembly, and the Senate. It's been my honor. It has been really fantastic experience, and it's one that I have done some servant leadership training on, and the chamber and other things, and I really happy to be able to continue to serve in a new venture, serving the members of the co-op and in rural communities across Wisconsin. And I will just say one last thing. When I came into the Senate, it was a lot of fanfare, loud noises and chanting, and people knew that you had arrived when I came into the Senate. When I left on May 13th and I packed up my office with my family, the Capitol was dark, it was locked, it was closed to the public. no staff were there. And honestly, my last picture with my family on the state Senate floor, I had to find the cleaning crew in one of the other offices to come take our picture. And so it felt like I left in a whisper, quietly. No one even knew I left, but I am excited to start this new adventure and this new journey and this new experience here with Dairyland Power and getting to know you on a different level working with our business community. So thank you, Vicki.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you on behalf of the Chamber for your prompt and regular participation in the forum. And thank you for your service to the state and the region over the last 20-some years. It's greatly appreciated.
Well, thank you. I was going to do the math of 20 years once a month. I know I maybe missed, 2 a year when I was on vacation or something, or took off a month or 2, but it's been a really valuable experience and just a great program for our community and for our elected officials to be able to have that face-to-face monthly with our elected officials, both federal and state.
I think it's worthwhile both ways. Thanks, Vicki. Good afternoon. I'm Joe Heim, and I'd like to welcome you to the monthly forum, which is a little unusual this year. It's a special virtual edition of the forum, and partly because we have a very special guest today. Rob Henkin is the president of the Wisconsin Policy Forum. This is an organization which was formed about 2 years ago, you just mentioned earlier, between the Wisconsin Taxpayer Alliance and the Policy Forum. Prior to that, he worked, I think he was president since 2008, if I remember correctly. He worked with the Milwaukee County government and he was a director of the research for the Milwaukee County Board. Prior to that, he worked at the Capitol Hill in Washington, so he's got some tremendous background and experience in this area. He was also the author of a number of books, articles, and he's won some national awards from the Government Research Association. In 2019, he was named the Person of the Year by the Milwaukee Rotary Club, which I thought was pretty impressive. Rob is going to talk to us about 2 different topics. It's going to be tricky to get this all in, Rob. COVID challenge ahead, fallout on government and schools, and secondarily, the benefits of intergovernmental service sharing and consolidation, and an update on a study which is going on in La Crosse right now, fire and EMS service sharing. So Rob, a virtual welcome to La Crosse.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. Thanks, Vicki, and thank you to the Chamber for having me this afternoon. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. And then just also a special shout out for Senator Schilling for her many years of public service. So thank you and congratulations on a well-deserved retirement from public service and a new career in the La Crosse area business community. So I'm going to share my screen momentarily. As Joe said, I want to cover a range of topics this afternoon. I'm going to do my best to make sure that they all connect in the end. And I want to also be sure to leave some time for all of your questions. So I am now firing up my presentation. So give me 1 second. Okay. There we go. All right, so first of all, as Joe said, the Wisconsin Policy Forum, created just 2 years ago as a result of the merger between the Madison-based Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance and the Milwaukee-based Public Policy Forum. Public Policy Forum around since 1913, WisTax since 1932. What both of these organizations have been known for, that we continue to subscribe to as the Wisconsin Policy Forum: nonpartisan research, informed and impartial analysis, and really our mission is to try to promote data-driven decision-making in local school districts, county governments, cities and villages and towns, and of course state government in Madison, data-driven decisions and thoughtful debate. Like this event, we have the name Forum in our name, and that was a very deliberate decision when we did the merger to keep that, because we see ourselves not only as an entity that puts out nonpartisan relevant policy research, but that also as an organization that can serve as a forum for interested parties, whether they be businesses or nonprofits or governments and school districts themselves or institutions or universities, we too see ourselves as a forum where people who are interested in thoughtful public policy decision-making can gather and can be part of an organization that promotes those principles. So what this pie is showing you is where our revenues come from. And we work very hard to maintain this balance between corporate, nonprofit, and government and school district. If we were too heavily funded on the corporate side, then perhaps people might assume that we skew right. If we were too heavily funded by the government or nonprofit side, then maybe rightly or wrongly, they might assume we skew left. We work very hard to make sure that we have this balance of funding. A little bit more about our organization. Our bread and butter is research, putting out nonpartisan policy research, and that can take many different forms. We do budget briefs, not only on the state of Wisconsin, but on some of Wisconsin's largest local governments, like the city of Milwaukee, Milwaukee County, city of Madison, and just a couple weeks ago, we put out comprehensive budget briefs on the Milwaukee Public Schools budget and the Madison Metropolitan School District budget. We also have a publication called the Wisconsin Taxpayer that we've retained since the merger. This was a long-time WisTax publication. That's a 6 to 8 page magazine type publication that hits on a very topical, relevant issue and a couple of key research questions. We also do longer reports. Dollars and Cents that you're seeing on the screen here is actually a comprehensive look we took at the municipal financing framework in Wisconsin and how we are dissimilar and also alike, though there aren't many ways that we're alike in terms of the way that we finance our municipal governments in this state. And then we have a shorter publication called Focus, where we do a quick snapshot of an issue, an important data point that we want to highlight, etc. So that's a little bit more about what we do. We also put out data tools, our municipal data tool. All of this available on our website, by the way, wispolicyforum.org. We have one on schools as well. We have one on property taxes and values. It's just data at your fingertips on various government and economic issues. Finally, facilitation is another one of our fortes. We are often brought in as an outside, objective, neutral, nonpartisan facilitator to help governments work together. And I'm going to give you a prime example of that in your region toward the end of my presentation when we talk about the La Crosse County area fire and EMS service sharing study. So that's just a little bit about us. Now let me get into the meat and potatoes. So what I want to cover for you, we've done a series of reports that have been published since the crisis broke in mid-March, assessing both the condition and vulnerabilities of state government to the economic downturn that, of course, has resulted from the COVID-19 crisis, as well as impacts on municipalities, counties, and school districts. So I want to go through a few slides that will hopefully summarize that data for all of you and give you a good sense for sort of where we were heading into this period of severe upheaval and what that says about how we might have to respond. So let's start with state government. A report that we put out in late March assessed the state of Wisconsin's readiness for recession. And as the words on this slide are saying to you, this is both a good news and a little disconcerting news story. On the good news side, there's no question that the state of Wisconsin is far better prepared for economic turmoil than it was heading into the Great Recession back in 2008. So what this chart is showing you is the cash ratio and quick ratio for state government. Now, those are two metrics of short-term fiscal health. Cash ratio is as it sounds. It's essentially your cash and cash equivalents on hand as a ratio of your short-term obligations. You obviously want that to be greater than 1. And as you can see, certainly the plunge in the wake of the Great Recession, not unexpected, but even heading into that period, we were at a far lower point in both the cash ratio, which is the turquoise, and the quick ratio, which is essentially the same thing, but it's also adding receivables. So it gives you a little bit of a better impression of where you are. But you can see the extent to which there has been improvement in this area. The bad news is that when we look across the country and the data are a little more dated there, we only can go through 2016 or 17, and clearly Wisconsin made more progress since that time. But the state of Wisconsin was sort of in the bottom third in terms of short-term fiscal condition measured by the cash and quick ratio. So better, clearly, than we were last time around, and it's obviously too early to tell just how bad this economic downturn is going to be compared to the Great Recession. But on the other hand, when compared to other states, maybe not quite as well equipped. The real bottom line is that state government, of course, has been running surpluses in recent years. And here you're seeing sort of the history since 2000 of state year-end. What this is showing you is the inflation-adjusted changes in net assets on a per capita basis. So here, of course, you'd want to see a positive number. Not surprising that in 2008 through 2010, this was either near zero or even negative. You can see that in recent years, and this is no secret, that the state of Wisconsin, tax revenues have been greater than forecast almost every year for the past several years, and this has allowed the state to run budget surpluses. One of the very favorable outcomes of that is the fact that the state's, both its general fund balance and its rainy day fund, the balances in those two areas have grown substantially. You can see how meager the state's reserves were heading into the Great Recession. You can see how that has picked up since the economic recovery happened beginning in 2012. And you can certainly see what happened in 2019 in terms of the growth of both the general fund and the rainy day fund. Now, no one clearly could have forecast the COVID-19 circumstances, the onset of just such severe economic upheaval so quickly. One piece of ironic good news is that there were plans being forwarded by both the governor and the Republican legislative leadership to spend down some of these surpluses just prior to the onset of the crisis. In this case, political disagreement and gridlock arguably was a good thing because there was no agreement made. So the state heading into this recession enjoyed a combination of a general and rainy day fund balance of about $1.7 billion, which, as you can see on this chart, clearly much bigger than it has enjoyed over the past 2 decades. Another very important thing that we look at, and actually let me just add one more thing on the state of the general fund and rainy day fund. That $1.74 billion is about enough to cover 10% of the state's general purpose revenue spending in a given year. So what's some context for that? 10% is typically around the point, sort of the minimum that in an ideal world you'd want to see your reserve levels at. Comparably speaking, however, the nationwide average for all states about 13%. So again, Wisconsin pretty darn well equipped in terms of these balances, but when we look across the 50 states, a little bit lower than that average of 13%. Now, a very big question, both for state government and for all of you as employers, is the state of the unemployment fund. Interesting story to tell here. There were lots of problems with the state's unemployment fund, looking back again over the past 20 years or so. Very meager fund balances heading into the Great Recession. Good news here too is that this has picked up considerably, so that fund balance in the unemployment fund nearing $2 billion heading into this calendar year. Now, clearly there is no state across the nation that could possibly have been equipped to deal with the type of swing in unemployment that we have witnessed over the past couple of months, notwithstanding the good news we received Friday that unemployment rate it now appears to be coming down a little bit. So again, a good news picture in terms of the level of fundedness. The bad news is Wisconsin 30th, as we look across the 50 states, in terms of its ability to cover 1 year of unemployment claims when we're looking at the average of the 3 highest claim years. So that sounded like a very reasonable metric, and it's one that's commonly used. Of course, if you look at the average of the 3 worst claim years, it's unlikely to approach what we are seeing this year. But again, important takeaway here, much, much better than we were heading into the last Great Recession, but about 30th across the 50 states in terms of the level of fundedness of our unemployment fund. Wrapping up on what we know about state government, there's so many unknowns in terms of what this is going to do to the state financially. A huge set of question marks regards federal aid. And we know that through the Federal CARES Act, Wisconsin is receiving about $2.3 billion. That money can only be used to respond to issues that have emerged as a direct result of the pandemic. So in terms of the revenue shortfalls that state government is now experiencing in sales and income tax revenues, these dollars can't be used directly to fill those holes. There are special pools of funding for education, both K-12 and higher ed. There's special pools of money for transit. So clearly this is going to be helpful, but just how helpful, still a little dubious. Some of the unknowns: what is going to be the length and severity of this economic downturn going forward? How quickly will the economy recover? And is there going to be more federal aid? Bottom line, and this is a nice segue into my discussion about local governments and school districts, there is a possibility that either by a trigger in state statutes or by choice, that the state legislature is going to have to go back into the current two-year budget. The second year of the two-year budget begins this July 1st, and look for cuts as a result of the revenue shortfalls that are occurring. And this shows the largest line items in the state budget and where, if indeed there has to be substantial budget cutting for the second year of the biennium, where there might be some impacts. And clearly K-12 school aids, whether that would be one's desire to cut there or not, if significant cuts are required, given the sheer magnitude of those in the state budget, there's certainly a chance those are going to have to be touched. The shared revenue program is shown here. That's a very important funding source to local governments. And there too, while certainly paling in comparison to K-12 school aids, that's another area that could be on the table. So just some food for thought as we move forward. Let me use that segue to now talk a little bit about cities and villages and counties and school districts. So we put out a report a couple months ago, actually about 6 weeks ago, on the COVID-19 fiscal fallout for cities and villages. Here too soon to project the full range of impacts, but clearly there are going to be impacts on municipal revenue streams. Now there's some sort of ironic good news here. The forum has talked a lot in previous reports about some of the problems with the municipal finance framework here in the state of Wisconsin. We as a state have made our cities and villages highly dependent on two forms of revenue: property taxes and state aids from the state of Wisconsin. In an ordinary world, that's something you don't really want to see. You'd like to see greater revenue diversity. You'd like to see potentially other forms of revenues, particularly for cities that have high levels of visitors and commuters, to try to sort of tap into all of the users to support local governments. In this case, however, our reliance on property taxes is actually a benefit because property taxes are going to be far more stable, presumably, in the face of this economic downturn than sales or income taxes. You can see on this slide the degree of dependence as we look across all cities and villages in the state of Wisconsin, and these were 2018 numbers, that roughly 42% of the overall revenue pie for municipalities are attributed to property taxes. This gives you a sense of the largest 20 cities. If you're wondering what the percentage is for the city of La Crosse, about 36% of La Crosse's overall revenue pie comes from the property tax. So that has, again, both its pluses and minuses. The plus side is that while undoubtedly we are going to see property taxes decline as a result of this economic upheaval, the nature of that decline is not going to be felt for quite some time. There has to be reassessment. There has to be plugging in new property values to tax rates and tax levies at the municipal level. Even as cities and villages prepare for their 2021 budgets, their property tax levies are going to be based on property tax values as of January 1st, 2020. So even 2021 budgets are not necessarily going to be impacted by any decline in property value. So that makes that a more stable source of revenue. The other thing is that here in Wisconsin, local governments can actually establish their levies based on levy limits that apply to the levy amounts and not the rates. So even to the extent that property values may decline, those governments will have the ability to raise the rate to be able to generate the same amount of property tax. So in this case, reliance on property taxes, the higher that percentage number, and again, La Crosse is sort of on the low end at 36%, the higher you are in that respect, maybe the more stable things are going to be for you. And here, the larger the circles are indicating just the amount of money being generated. Just to give you, again, some context for the city of La Crosse, the levy is about $34.4 million. That's of 2018 out of a total budget of about, general fund budget of about $97 million. Another critical source of revenue for local governments, though far less influential than the property tax or state aids, a wide variety of different types of public service charges. Here, for several of these, there shouldn't be an impact. Actually, so refuse and garbage collection presumably should not be as impacted as much as things like parks fees, which certainly will be, given that so many parks have been closed for some time. I know in the city of La Crosse, which owns a convention center, that's a big revenue hit, as the revenue coming in obviously has slowed or stopped, and there's still a need to maintain that facility and to pay staff. But so it really depends in terms of your local governments for what types of public service charges they are dependent upon. But this is an area, depending on the charge, which could be hurt if we're talking about the parks, culture, and recreation areas. In other areas, for things like solid waste disposal, maybe not. Fines, forfeitures, license, and permits. These are much smaller sources. This is showing you the 20 largest cities and villages. Fines and forfeitures can include parking fines, various court fees, given that people are driving less and parking less. There is certainly going to be a revenue hit for local governments in those areas. Many of the license and permit fees on which cities and villages depend are linked to real estate transactions, which obviously have slowed. So there will be revenue hits in these areas. The good news is, as you can see here, the percentage in terms of the amount of reliance in municipal budgets for these forms of revenue, not great. City of La Crosse combined, these are about 3.5%, just as an example. Room and resort taxes, also an area that obviously are going to take a hit. The good news here, again, not huge percentage of reliance among the cities and villages in Wisconsin. That's not the case in some very heavy tourism areas. There, the hit could be much more substantial. But generally speaking, again, while there will be a hit here, these are relatively minor forms of revenue for local governments. So what's the bottom line here? Again, heavy reliance on property taxes and even state aids. Notwithstanding the danger of a budget repair bill, state aids have been set at least for this fiscal year. There is a question mark for the next one, but that's now advantageous. Delinquent property taxes are an issue, people unable to pay their property tax bills, but ultimately most delinquent property tax payments, the responsibility for collecting those falls to counties, so there shouldn't be as great a municipal impact. Loss of fee, fine, and permit revenue will have varying impacts. So much here for cities and villages, again, depends on the what their condition was heading into the crisis, the extent to which there may be some more federal and state help available, and what new expenditure demands they may face as a result of the pandemic. Overall, many will face diminished revenue streams. There's already have had to be cuts, as I'm sure most of you know, in the city of La Crosse, but not the type of devastation that perhaps these local governments would be seeing if there was reliance on other forms of revenue like sales or income taxes. Let me switch quickly to counties. In many ways, the messaging here is similar as it is for cities and villages in Wisconsin. What I'm showing you here is the reliance on these various forms of revenues as we look across the state's 72 counties. Here, the most noticeable distinction, however, is that 68 of the 72 counties in Wisconsin levy a half-cent sales tax. So there's absolutely no question that sales tax collections are plummeting. For La Crosse County, the sales tax is about a $12.9 million revenue source out of a total general revenue stream of about $110 million. So that's about 12% of La Crosse County's budget. You can see how things look across the state. So clearly there will be a hit. If sales tax revenues decline by 20%, and that's what a lot of urban counties are projecting, that's a $2.5 million hit potentially for La Crosse County. This shows you the degree of reliance on the property tax. Again, here a higher level of property tax reliance is probably a good indicator. For La Crosse County, its level is about 28%. So clearly on the low side, which in this case, again, is somewhat disadvantageous because other revenue streams are going to be more vulnerable to disruption. This just shows you, again, sales tax reliability looking across the state. Public service charges, particularly in the area of health and human services, are very important to counties. Hard to say how these are going to be impacted. In large part, it depends on what's going on with Medicaid and what types of health and human services charges. Here we see that parks and register of deeds fees are two areas that are likely to be hit hard. And so a big question mark is, what is your reliance on those types of sources? Public service charges are about 13% of La Crosse County's budget. Bottom line for counties, again, there are going to be sales tax declines that are going to hurt county governments. There are going to be demands for additional spending as a result of the pandemic in certain public safety areas and public health areas. Reliance on property tax here too is helpful, except for an immediate rise potentially in unpaid tax installments. I mentioned recreational and register of deeds fees as relatively small portions of the revenue pie, but ones that will get hit. And here too, so much depends on the condition of each individual county government heading into this crisis. Turning briefly to schools. In Wisconsin, schools are very highly reliant on state aid, as this chart is showing you more so than the US average. This is also showing you the high reliance on property taxes, but certainly lower because of the greater reliance on state aids than for cities, villages, and counties. State aids is a big concern. So again, we don't know what's going to happen in terms of a state budget repair bill that could impact the upcoming school year. We don't know what's going to happen then with the next two-year budget. We don't know how long the economic downturn and the plunge in sales and income tax collections are going to last. But clearly, because school districts are so reliant on state aids, and because state aids make up such a sizable portion of the state budget, this is clearly cause for concern. What this is showing you is a study we did that looked at the 10 largest school districts. And really, when you're thinking about your local district, and I just don't have the data at my fingertips for the La Crosse schools, but you're looking, two of the things we can look at is the reliance on state aid and also the general fund balance heading into the crisis. So this shows you that there's really, it goes across the board among the 10 largest districts. If you're more reliant on state aid and if you had fewer reserves heading into this, then you're apt, obviously, to be more severely impacted. So there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. I just now want to make a pivot into shared services and consolidation research. This has been a very important body of work for the Wisconsin Policy Forum. This is showing you some report covers of some studies we have done in Milwaukee County on dispatch consolidation, on fire and emergency medical services connection or consolidation. We've also done studies in Kenosha County and in Racine County, and in fact just released two big studies for the communities in Greater Racine. Now there's clearly a connection between service sharing and consolidation and some of the fiscal issues that local governments are facing as a result of the pandemic. So I wanted to share with you just a couple slides. One of the foremost examples of a successful fire department consolidation, not only in the state of Wisconsin, but nationally, is the consolidation of 7 departments in Milwaukee County's North Shore into a consolidated North Shore Fire Department. And upon the 20-year anniversary of that consolidation, back in 2016, we produced an in-depth analysis of what that meant from a program service level perspective as well as a fiscal perspective. I have a bunch of slides I don't have time to share with you that lay out the fact that arguably, as we looked back 20 years after the merger, a far better level of service using far fewer resources. The region now has only 5 fire stations as opposed to 7. There are about a dozen fewer firefighters. There is less apparatus, fire vehicles, but the ISO ratings, which the insurance company gives, this department is rated as a 2, which is the second best rating and far higher than the previous 7 departments. And on many metrics that we looked at, we could see that service levels had improved in comparison to what existed when there were 7 individual departments. But I'd also just like to share with you a couple of fiscal slides. What this is showing you is what the collective budgets were, and we had to use 13 and 14 data at the time. But 20 years earlier, what the 7 fire departments spent on fire and EMS, what they would have been spending if we had adjusted their 93 numbers to 2013 numbers. So that's the jump from 7.7 to 12.7 million. What they would have been spending if we had also adjusted service levels so that each of the 7 departments was essentially providing service at the level that the existing North Shore Fire Department was. And then we're showing you in the final bar what they were actually spending. So about a $2.8 million savings across these 7 communities in terms of what we projected they would have been spending had they tried to achieve the same level of fire and rescue service acting on their own, as opposed to having consolidated into one department. I'm going to skip through this just to say that there are also, we found some very significant savings in terms of capital spending on vehicle replacements as a result of having a consolidated department. So why am I telling you that? Well, again, we've done a series of service sharing studies, and really there's been a lot that we have learned. So here I seem to be contradicting myself because I've told you about dollar savings, but one of our findings has been that really the promise lies not in saving money, but in the potential for individual governments to join forces to achieve levels of service quality and efficiency they could not achieve alone. If we just want to look at the promise of consolidation and service sharing as what will I get comparing my present state to a future state when I consolidate, we may not see many benefits. But if we instead compare a consolidated state to a future state where several individual jurisdictions would all have to spend money to achieve a higher level of service, that's where real benefits can come into play. We know that national research cautions that in many cases service sharing doesn't make sense. Some of the conditions you would want to see: retirement of a key leader or leaders, new requirements coming from the federal government or from constituent demands that require substantial investments in technology or staff, evidence where there's clear duplication among local governments in a region. Is there a previous history of cooperation? And is there a mutual desire to cooperate on broader economic development or related issues? So those are some of the things we look at, some of the lessons we learned. You have to be clear about the objectives. If dollar savings are the only driver, then perhaps you shouldn't bother. Conversely, you need to engage your chiefs, your administrators, your medical directors, other stakeholders who can credibly convey the importance of achieving enhanced service levels. And you have to be just as clear about the consequences of not sharing or merging services as you are about the benefits. So all of this finally leads me to a study that we are currently engaged in. We are looking at fire and EMS service sharing across La Crosse County. We are also including La Crescent in Minnesota. How did this come about? I want to thank the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse which approached the forum and asked if we would come to La Crosse County, host a couple of preliminary meetings or participate in a couple of preliminary meetings with the fire chiefs and administrators that were hosted by the area planning committee in the county. Those took place last August and September. And as a result of that, there was consensus established to pursue a study to look at the broad range of service sharing options. This is not a study simply looking at whether all of the La Crosse area fire departments should be consolidated, some or all. It's looking at the broad spectrum of potential service sharing options that might be pursued by your community. That study launched in January. We had a kickoff meeting with stakeholders on February 4th. Unfortunately, we took a 1-month hiatus when the crisis hit. We did not want to have to be bothering public safety officials to meet with us and provide data to us as they were responding to COVID-19, but we are very much back up and running. Initial data gathering, synthesis, analysis is now complete, and we're holding another virtual stakeholders meeting later this month at which we'll discuss our initial findings and a path forward from here. Just a little bit of background. This shows you where the fire and EMS station locations are located for those who are participating in the study. There are a few communities that opted not to participate. But clearly, lots of fire stations. One of the big questions here, not only are there opportunities to share services in a greater way among these stations, but to the extent that we're looking at expansion, and the city of La Crosse is considering possibly 2 additional stations, is there an opportunity to do some sharing in terms of the cost and the usage of those 2 stations? There's a need here. When we look at county population projections, and here we're showing the 65 and over population, that's the population that tends to result in the greatest number of emergency medical services calls. Clearly, this shows a growing population of 65 and over, which will undoubtedly produce heavier call volumes. And indeed, already we have seen some very substantial increased calls for service, as I'm showing you on this table. This is not just obviously a result of an aging population. In terms of the Holman area department, there's been some significant economic development and growth that also can produce greater call volumes. There are some response time issues here. These are not terrible response times, and these are for EMS. But clearly, for most areas, you'd want to be in that 6 to 8 minute range in terms of the first response, and we're not seeing that across the board. So this is an area that might suggest that greater cooperation could actually address some service level gaps. So I'm going to give you a sneak preview, and this is my final slide, of sort of some initial observations that we've gleaned from collecting data, doing a series of interviews with the key stakeholders so far. First of all, I don't think there's any question that the growth that has occurred in Onalaska and the Holman area may require capacity enhancements. I mentioned La Crosse considering 2 new stations, and clearly a question that could and should be asked is to what extent there's an opportunity to share those 2 new stations to potentially address some of the need for added capacity in some of these other communities. In some respects, in the western part of the county, the decision on whether to share or consolidate hinges on whether these suburban communities actually want to have a higher level of service. The La Crosse department offers a full-time firefighting staff, a full-service department. The other departments have a mix of either full or part-time, or in some cases, they're all part-time and volunteer. Whether communities want to get up to that higher level of service is a big question, and whether they wish to pay more to do so. If they do, if there's consensus there, then coordinating and cooperating to get up to that level of service could be beneficial to all. As I noted, some EMS response times may dictate consideration of a modified or new model for emergency medical services. And finally, just an observation, we haven't had time to dig into it yet, but mutual aid among these departments does not appear to be utilized as often as we've seen it in other regions. There may be some very good reasons for that, but another sort of indicator that there's some promise here to enhance some service sharing and some collaboration. So I've been talking for a long time, and I'm going to stop sharing, and I would be happy to field any questions that anyone may have.
Rob, I'll start off with a quick question. I know the literature in this area talks about barriers to intergovernmental cooperation. could you identify some of those barriers and then comment on to the degree to which you think they, at least off the top of your head, think these barriers exist in the La Crosse area?
It's a great question, Joe, and thank you. So I'll start with my wonky barriers, and I'll go into my political ones. You know, the wonky ones are how alike our communities. It's much more difficult for communities that have different demographics, that have different socioeconomics, that have different needs and experiences. They tend not to be as suitable in terms of partnership. It's just tougher to put them together. Does it mean it can't be done? No. Again, we've done a lot of work in the greater Racine area, and there's big differences between the city of Racine and some of its suburbs like Mount Pleasant and Caledonia. We still see some promise there. So that's one of the things. And so I think another big one, however, is just the level of cooperation. And clearly, I don't think I'm telling any secrets here. We know that there has been some tension between the city of La Crosse and the suburban communities on some issues. I think one of the things we have seen so far that we've been very impressed with is just the enthusiasm from the chiefs and the administrators to actually do this study. So we are certainly seeing the fire chiefs very eager to roll up their sleeves and explore the options. All that said, again, if the politics are difficult, ultimately, to the extent that you want to implement service sharing or consolidation options, you have to figure out a way to equitably allocate those costs. And that's where, if there are big political tensions going in, it can often be tough to do that.
Thank you. Other questions or comments from those online here?
Hi there, it's Tanya from Fort McCoy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I have a question having to do with federal government, federal services. Have you found any interesting ways that federal can work with state or local municipalities?
So the short answer is yes. Tanya, do you mean with regard to service sharing in particular, or just in general?
Possibly just in general, but we're really services, but yes, in general also. Any information.
Yep. So, I mean, you know, the federal, state, local relationship is a very, very complicated situation that can certainly differ from, you know, federal administration to federal administration. I think generally speaking, let's just talk about this, you know, the whole COVID-19 response. I think a big question mark here is the extent to which the federal government is going to recognize the limitations of state governments and local governments to address some of the very real consequences of this very severe economic downturn. The advantage the federal government has is it does not have to produce a balanced budget, and in fact has seldom done so. And I'm not going to tell you that's a good thing, but in this case, if there is a desire to spend money to ensure that, number one, local governments and state government remain prepared to deal with the public health and public safety elements of this crisis. Number two, to accommodate the fact that they do have to produce balanced budgets. And I think clearly there's going to have to be consideration for greater forms of federal aid. I think a big question mark is, to the extent that there is that going to be aid that, as has happened so far, is very directly steered toward some very real issues that have emanated from the pandemic, as opposed to, does the federal government have any role in terms of helping local governments and state governments address their huge reductions in tax revenues that they will undoubtedly be facing, that if they go unaddressed, are bound to lead to reductions in vital services. That's a very, very difficult question. I see, you know, valid points on both sides. I certainly see valid points in terms of not wanting to see big cuts in services and even in public sector jobs at this time. At the same time, I think there is some merit in some of the concerns of the federal government giving money to state and local governments that have been irresponsible fiscally and essentially bailing them out. I do think there's a happy medium, however.
Thank you.
Any other questions out there? I'll throw in one additional, Rob. Other than fire and EMS, are there any other services that are decent candidates or good candidates for sharing or consolidation, looking over the rest of the state of Wisconsin? My understanding of research is we are not at the forefront of sharing and consolidation in the country. So can you identify any other services that might be potential for either sharing or consolidation in the state?
Yep, another great question, Joe. And you're right, we are not at the forefront, though in some areas we've done well. So, you know, public safety dispatch is an obvious one. In La Crosse County, you've done that, and that's good. In Milwaukee County, believe it or not, there's 11 different public safety dispatch entities in a county that has 19 municipalities, which makes little sense. Public health is another one where Milwaukee County has separate municipal health departments. Public health is done at the county level throughout almost the entire rest of the state. So it tends to be fire and EMS are obviously the big ones. And one of the reasons for that is, and I didn't get into it much in my discussion, but where dollar savings really have the most potential is in terms of equipment. So when we have types of services that require very heavy investment in things like ladder trucks and engines and technology, those are the areas where combining and sharing can really tend to produce dollar savings and make the whole thing worthwhile. So that's why fire and EMS really is the one that's looked at the most. I think another one, parks and recreation. And here we have a mix of municipal and county in most areas of the state. And so clearly you could go county by county and see whether there are benefits there. And that's an area where in the rest of the country, we do tend to see parks and rec at a higher regional level as opposed to municipal or county levels.
Thanks. Other questions out there?
Oh, I do see on the chat that someone just, a couple of questions have come up. Should I quickly tackle those, Joe?
Go ahead, Rob. Yeah.
So unfortunately, the first one, I don't know, it was on a specific slide. Any idea where our communities are amongst those blue dots? And I can't comment because I don't know which blue dots, but hopefully I gave that information. But the second one is a very, very apt, timely comment, which is, can Rob address what the defunding the police movement would look like? That comes from Nathan Franklin. Nathan, I'd be crazy to try to tackle all of the dimensions of that question. But let me say, I mean, you know, clearly one of the big points there is, what are we talking about when we're talking about defunding? Does that mean eliminating? I don't think anybody's talking about eliminating police forces, though clearly, as we've seen in the Twin Cities, in Minneapolis, there's talk about eliminating what currently exists and creating something new. I think mostly what defunding is talking about is shifting some municipal dollars. Police does tend to be the #1 spending area for municipal governments. And to what extent would you want to divert some of those dollars into various social programs and economic programs that ostensibly might be more effective in deterring crime and so forth than having more police on the street? To me, you have to go community by community. I think that conversation in Wisconsin is going to get skewed a little bit because in Wisconsin, one of the reasons we're spending more on police and fire, for that matter, is that Wisconsin Act 10, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, does not apply to police and fire. You know, sort of determining whether too much is being spent has to take that factor into account. I think you have to look at crime rates. I think you have to look at the effectiveness of various housing and public health and other programs where you ostensibly want to spend these dollars if you're not spending them on police, and going city by city. You know, are these programs working? Are there programs that merit further investment? But to me, it's a healthy conversation, and not just as a result of police brutality and the tragic events of recent days, but just from a fiscal perspective. local governments have really been in a very tight vice for many, many years. And given that that is the number one spending center, just asking that question, irrespective of anything that's gone on over the past several weeks, seems to me to be a good idea.
Any other questions out there? Okay. Vicki, do you have any announcements or any questions you want to bring up?
Not at this time. I think we hit most of them.
Okay. Well, we're at our 1 o'clock time, so I think maybe it'd be wise to stop this. Rob, I'd like to thank you for an outstanding presentation. Very insightful, very interesting. I look forward to the report of the study done in the La Crosse area. I liked it a lot, and I think everybody else did too. Also, I'd like to thank Maggie Krishnan for organizing this event and putting it all together. So thanks very much to both of you. Vicki?
Yes, and thank you, Joe Heim, for doing this. I know you are officially retired, but still do this out of passion, and we appreciate that. And I don't know if Jennifer's still on with us, but and you did speak very eloquently, but Jennifer, it has been truly a pleasure and privilege to work with you over these years. I'm glad that that will continue. Thank you for your service. And to everybody else on here, we will see you the next time. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Vicki.